Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus for the week beginning on New Year's Eve in the North American realms and New Year's Day on the European servers. This week's affixes are tyrannical, raging, explosive, and the beguiling pattern is tides heavy. It's a pretty rough week for high keys because tyrannical is active and the tides pattern isn't perfectly ideal either. Of the tyrannical weeks, it's one of the okayer ones, but it's still not great. In medium to low keys, especially if you have an enraged dispel for raging and you have somebody in your group who's capable of killing the explosive orbs, then it'll be a pretty good week. You're going to have to be careful though. Explosives can be a real threat, especially in pulls that have a tides active, right? That's a lot of... those affixes both add quite a bit of spiky damage to random members of your group. Like the explosive orbs will hit everybody in the group, and the like a raging tides affected caster is going to be just shooting lightning bolts or whatever that you can't interrupt at your whole party. So the combination of those two can kill people out of nowhere. So you do have to be very careful of that. But if you have somebody in your group like an Outlaw Rogue or a Fury Warrior, somebody who's really good at killing a Havoc Demon Hunter, those are specs that are very good at killing explosive orbs. If your group is comprised of one or two of those, or if your tank is comfortable helping out, or your healer killing a lot of explosive orbs, it should be a pretty good week. If you don't have those, if your group is full of more like ranged specs or, assassination rogues instead of outlaw rogues, then you're going to have a harder time with the explosive part of this week. And you may need to be a lot more careful with how many enemies you pull at once. All right, so let's go dungeon by dungeon with my expert routes from Raider.io, where I make routes every week. Ataldazar. So this is one of the two beguiling patterns out of three where you can't pull all six of these without getting a Tides Emissary involved, which kind of sucks because that would be a pretty nice way to start the dungeon this week. But since it's tyrannical, usually starting off with just a Lust on Razan is a totally valid strategy. Not too many awful pulls in here with explosive, not really many situations where you want to pull more than, say, 6 mobs at once anyways, which is normally when explosive starts to get out of control. You're going to have to watch out for errant explosives on totems while you're fighting Volkal. Watch out for them on ads during the Yasma fight and during the Alunza fight. If you CC, like if you Entangling Roots or whatever, one of her ads that she spawns, that can be an explosive spawner, so you do have to be really careful. Almost every boss fight in this, in fact, every single boss fight in this dungeon can have ads, and they can be in weird places. Raptors even on Razan can spawn far away by the time they actually finish activating. So you have to keep your eyes out for those, because that, combined with Tyrannical, can be pretty lethal. Outside of that, one of the big things this week is just making sure that you don't get this Tides Emissary in with this pull. The way to do that is you just tag this Honor Guard and pull it over to the side this way, and you'll never get in combat with this Emissary of the Tides. This usually requires a ranged kick on the first Augur cast in order to get it to come in and not just be right here where you can't actually run up to it because the Tides is too close and you'll proxy pull it then. And of course, this week you do have to worry about this Void Touched Emissary here that is pretty slow. Other than that, there's not really any mandatory voids to kill. I have this one in the route, but you could easily go left instead if you wanted and avoid skipping that, or avoid fighting that one. Freehold this week, you're going to want to make sure that you have Bloodlust for the first and second bosses. Both of those are hard with Tyrannical. Tyrannical Eudora, very, very scary. Tyrannical Explosive, also pretty annoying on this fight because these two bosses will separate sometimes, so you need to watch out for explosive spawning in weird places. On the explosive boss fight note, Harlan Sweet, his ads can be an explosive spawn point, and that can be very, very lethal if you're not paying attention to it. If somebody isn't watching explosive spawns on Harlan Sweet, usually if you have a ranged DPS player, they're the best people to be watching out for that. Otherwise, a healer job is usually what it comes down to, because you don't want melee or tanks switching off the boss to run out and kill some explosives on whatever rooted ad is out there. Beyond that, not too many horrific raging threats here. If you can get dispels on like Harpooners, if you're choosing to fight those, that'll be a good thing to do. And you do have to be careful of really pulling more than 7 or 8 of these enemies at once. So if you're pulling 3 packs at once or 2 full packs at once before joining the crew, that's when you might start to get into explosive difficulties here. If you fight all of these enemies at the front as your first pull of the dungeon, that can also be pretty scary. It might be worth doing. I would recommend only doing that if you feel like you can do it without using Bloodlust, because you really are going to want to have Bloodlust for Skycap and Crag. So if one option is, you can fight just 6 of these enemies. That's a pretty safe way. It might be a little slow. Faster options might be skipping it entirely or pulling all 10 of these, but you need to be able to do that without using Bloodlust. So be careful of that. Otherwise, Freehold, not great, but not terrible. Kingswrath Tyrannical, pretty sketchy. any week. Explosive week is certainly no exception, especially because there are ads that'll be active on the first boss, the second boss if you're really bad, the third boss, and the fourth boss. All of those bosses can have ad spawning explosives that you do have to be careful of, so watch out for that. In this first room here, one trick that you may not be aware of is this pull. It's possible to avoid pulling this Emissary of the Tides with the pack. I'd recommend never fighting an Emissary of the Tides at the same time as a Witch Doctor if you can avoid it. So if you want to do that, the strategy is you just want to tag this Shadowborn Warrior and then make sure that you're out of line of sight of this Witch Doctor so that it doesn't just start casting on you. If it starts casting on you, it will stay long enough in combat with you next to this Tides to get the Tides in combat. But if you just tag this warrior and then run back around this little middle thing, then the Witch Doctor will immediately run over to you, and that'll be long enough to cause it to be far enough away from the Tides when combat's checked like a second later, and the Tides won't get in combat. So yeah, pull this warrior and make sure you're out of line of sight so that the Witch Doctor has to run to you, and you can avoid fighting this Tides until, generally it's safe to pull it in when the Witch Doctor's dead. You can also wait until the champion is dead as well, especially if you're doing this thing without an Enrage Dispel. This champion has a nasty Enrage that's going to be at its worst when it also has Raging. So if that's happening, these are going to be very, very deadly, and you're going to need to be careful and probably just not get hit by them. Other than that, nothing too bad in here. This is a pretty good beguiling pattern. You don't have to fight very many Void-Touched Emissaries at all. This one here, after Shadowzul, is just skippable. You can just get in combat with it and then run on through and ignore it and fight Kingswrath and never kill this thing. So I'd recommend doing that. Shrine of the Storm is one of the dungeons where I find Explosive to be the most annoying, largely because of how it plays in the last boss fight. When you have ads active on this last boss fight, they are just spawning explosives all over the platform, and it's very frustrating to deal with because usually you're trying to meet a DPS check and burn this thing down before getting an extra phase. On Tyrannical in particular, this boss fight can just take so long. So this is the kind of thing where I don't know. It depends on what level key you're doing, but in my keys, we have like 10 minutes on the clock as we finish Lord Stormsong, and we're feeling good about ourselves. We swim down here, and we're just like out of time, and we still haven't killed Volzith 10 minutes later. The thing just takes so long, so do be ready for that. Outside of that, nothing too bad in here. Yeah, none of the really, really tragic Void-Touched Emissaries. There's this one, which I have as part of a death skip here. You could fight it. I'd recommend death skipping it or doing that druid skip thing that you may have seen floating about with the travel form evade reset bug. And then this Void-Touched Emissary here, safe to kill, pretty safe to kill. There's nice line of sight right nearby, so you may want to just run in, grab all this stuff, kill it outside, and then kill this Void later by itself. Or you may elect to do it with this pack. Both of those are totally fine options. Raging is something if you choose to pull a mini-boss here, which my route doesn't include any of these, but sometimes groups do choose to pull, Heldis, Sorn, or the Guardian Elemental. All three of those can be pretty lethal if they're raging, so I would really recommend not doing that unless you have an Enrage Dispel. If you don't have an Enrage Dispel, you also are going to want to make sure that you're not getting Water Blasts cast when these enemies are raging, because those will kill your tank quite quickly, even though it's only Tyrannical week. In Siege, this is the week where we get the most annoying Void-Touched Emissary in this Bilge Rat quarter. This one here that basically always interferes with your Shroud. So this turns into a death skip, or at least sacrificing one person, depending on if your group is able to, what kind of skips your group is able to execute here, or Shadow Melding, if you're fortunate enough to be a group that has access to Shadow Meld. So that's something that you're going to have to plan for. You could just kill more trash in this area and skip more stuff earlier. That's an option as well. Or you can just convert it into a death skip. That's totally fine as well. One of the advantages of converting this into a death skip is that you may also be able to start the timer on this Enchanted Emissary and get it out of there faster. So that can be helpful. Beyond that, Tyrannical Siege, main problem is Tyrannical. Raging, bad if you're Alliance side, not too bad if you're Horde side, because we can skip almost all of the things that will seriously become a raging threat. And if there are, if there's anything that's too bad with raging, there's only usually one of it at a time. If you're looking at this stupid Alliance path, some of these pulls here, it's very difficult to avoid getting into one-shot range with raging, so be very careful of that if you're an Alliance group. But if you're a Horde side group, not too bad. Do still bring your Soothe. Definitely don't pull this Irontide Raider if you don't have a Soothe in your group. It is skippable, so skipping that, even if you do have a Soothe in your group, is generally the strategy these days. But if you don't have a Soothe in your group, absolutely stay away from this thing. That'll start just randomly one-shotting people in your group. Also worth noting, since it is a raging week in Siege of Borealis, whenever you're fighting an Ashvane spotter, you may want to intentionally get it below 30% so that it starts raging. It will do a runaway, it'll flee at 30% as well. So you need to be a little bit careful if you're relying on getting some shots in the next 20 seconds. Pushing it below 30% is going to cause it to run away. But Generally, if you're going to carry a spotter into a next pull, it's worth bringing it below 30%, getting that enrage buff on it, and then you'll be able to finish the next pull all that much faster. Final note though, if you are ever using an Ashvane spotter and it's hanging out somewhere outside the group, you have to make sure that you're watching it for explosives. If for some reason your spotter is hanging out over here and you're fighting a pack up here, that spotter is a locus on which explosives can spawn, so you do need to be careful and look out for those and either be out of line of sight of it, which is usually not realistic because usually that spotter is going to run into line of sight of where you are, or make sure that somebody is near it and ready to kill explosives. Temple of Sethralis, we have a couple of awkward raging pulls. Raging static charge dervishes, even on fortified, or even on tyrannical rather, can be pretty scary. So killing these off, focus targeting one and then killing the others after you've got one down and made the pack a little bit less dangerous is a good strat. Especially if you don't have a soothe. If you have a soothe, just usually not too bad. You can just soothe them and make sure you get them below 30% one at a time. Beyond that, bosses are the main problem here. Obviously, Galv, always a tough boss on tyrannical. First two bosses, no joke either. Big problem boss is the last boss with explosive active. Especially if you don't have ranged DPS players, you're going to probably need to assign members of your group to parts of the room to watch for explosives. So generally, you're going to kill this Hexer, and you're going to kill the first Guardian on it. So, a tank and a melee DPS are going to be here. A healer might be over here watching this one, and your ranged DPS may take care of explosives on the other side of the room. That's a good way to handle this. Even then, things are going to get very hectic. Everybody's going to need to be on top of their game with explosives, especially in that second phase where you're getting just the waves of toads and everything as well. So, handling this fight with explosive is honestly, it's probably harder than Galv. Numbers aside, just the execution of that is a pretty difficult thing to do. So look out for that and don't assume you've won the dungeon after you've beaten Galv, which is normally a fairly safe assumption to make if you're ahead on the timer. Tyrannical Motherlode. Motherlode is our favorite tyrannical dungeon, or it's my favorite tyrannical dungeon at least. I think that this is one of the few dungeons left in the game where it's not a bad tyrannical dungeon. Honestly, I might prefer it to fortified. This enchanted, or this beguiling pattern rather, is quite good as well. It's quite good. You do have to watch out really for nothing too bad as far as emissaries go here. There's like this one's kind of a pain here if you're going to fight this pack, but even then they're on a hill, so you can pretty easily move the Earth Shapers so that they're slightly a different elevation of the tides, and then they don't get the aura, so that can work out nice into your advantage here. And then a standard, death skip through this area means you don't have to deal with any emissaries there, and then you can finish getting your trash count from the R&D wing, more or less. You can do, pulling this much of the VMZ rather, the VMZ, not the R&D wing, the VMZ is probably a little bit more than most groups are going to do. Many groups will instead get more trash from this area. You do need to be careful depending on what you're pulling a tides with. Tides with a refreshment vendor is a little bit spooky. What you can always do if you have a pull that includes a tides and a refreshment vendor is pull the tides out first and then CC the vendor far away and don't pull it back in until the tides is dead. So if you want to pull something like this pack and get this tides and this refreshment vendor, that's probably the way that I would do it. But if you want to avoid it and you want to instead pull this kind of stuff, that's also totally valid. Raging is something you do have to be very careful of on pretty much all the trash mobs in this area. They can become lethal with raging. Even mech jockeys, people don't know this, but mech jockeys do huge amounts of damage as the keystone level scales up with Grease Gun, where they'll just start randomly blasting people for huge amounts of damage. So making sure to soothe mech jockeys that are low, if your tank is kiting in particular, is going to save lives. And then soothing mechanized peacekeepers, addled thugs, hired assassins. Hired assassins probably the lowest soothe priority as long as you have them under control. If you don't have them under control, then obviously highest soothe priority. And then of course refreshment vendors. So that's how I'd attack this dungeon this week. It's one of the better ones. I think that it's one of the ones where you may see some fairly competitive, rankings on. One of the problems with ranking on a good dungeon in a bad week though is that it's just hard to get high Motherlode keys because you're not going to be able to, push most other dungeons you get are less likely to be keystones upgraded and more likely to be depletes. So even if this were a week where theoretically fairly high Motherlode keys were possible, it's just the key availability is a lot lower than on the weeks where every dungeon is good. So I wouldn't necessarily expect to see, super high Motherlodes timed this week. The Underon is good pretty much every week. Raging is actually one of the affixes that you do have to be very careful of in here on Feral Bloodswarmers. So probably don't come in here without a soothe. If you do come in here without a soothe, probably the strategy here is going to be to avoid getting these things on stun DR until they push below Raging, and then start stunning them, start hard CCing them below there. Or you can try and kite them. There are ways to kite this enemy, particularly if it's slowed. where you stay close enough to it that it won't charge to you, and far enough away from it that it can't hit you. But that's not something that every group is comfortable doing. So if you're not playing with a set of people that know how to do that, I'd recommend, keeping it stunned if you can't soothe it below 30%. This is also a week where you are going to have to deal with this Tide's Emissary next to these two Defilers. There are actually a couple of places you can pull these Defilers such that they'll be on a different elevation than the Tides and make them kickable that way. But that is a little bit sketchy. I would recommend usually using Ring of Peace or Entangling Roots or Polymorph as your main answer to this Tide. So either Ring of Peace before pulling it so that it's far enough away that it doesn't get in combat. That can be pretty tough to do. You need to pretty perfect Ring of Peace in order to get that, that correct distance there. So that may not actually work out for you. Entangling Roots and Polymorph spam on the Tides is usually a safer way, but it does require, your Druid or your Mage to commit a global every 8 seconds to it. So that can be pretty annoying for them. Toldagor with the Tides pattern active is actually one of the more annoying Void Emissary patterns. You're going to have to deal with these two awkward voids near the start of the dungeon, and they're in this brig area, which you don't really want to death skip through here because you want to open up these cages and get the buffs from them, especially on a tyrannical week. You're going to want to make sure that you have all 4 of these buffs, ideally, before engaging the last boss if you're in a high key, so you're probably going to need to end up clearing out these Void-Touched Emissaries. Probably involves pulling this thing on the bridge, too. That might be an adjustment to this route that would make sense to do. So those voids are annoying, and then you go up into this area. This area, not too bad this week, although you are going to have to deal with Tides Emissaries next to both of the double Sea Speaker packs, so actually is pretty bad. When the words come out of my mouth, I realize that that's not a good thing to have happen to you, so strategy I'd recommend here, pull out the Tides and CC the Sea Speakers, unless you're capable of running in and just nuking these things. Something like Double Spell Reflect on the first 2 Salt Blasts? Yeah, Salt Blasts. Is something I would advise having if you want to use that strategy. Otherwise, just pull out the Tides and CC the Sea Speakers, or line of sight the Sea Speakers and chain roots on the Tides, but that's a little bit more intensive and a little bit more prone to failure in my experience. I think that the best strategy is actually CCing the casters rather than the Tides. Just pull the Tides out first. And finally, Waycrest Manor. A couple of targets in this dungeon that are likely to be very dangerous without soothes are Matron Brindle. Matron Brindle, you can actually skip this enemy if you have somebody with a vanish or whatever. They can pull it to the side, and then you can pull the Goliath out, and then you can vanish and drop threat with Matron. That is something that you could try doing if you don't have a soothe. But if you do want to fight this thing, I'd recommend having a soothe for it. Soothes can also be useful on the witches, both the ones that spawn randomly in the first area and any that you end up fighting, like the ones that you fight down here. Especially like Soul Charmers, if they're getting Raging Soul Bolts or Soul Volleys off, that can be pretty dangerous. These enemies here, unlikely that you'll be able to soothe all of them. They'll probably be getting pushed below 30% around the same time. So splitting it in half is one strategy, fighting 3 and then 4, or just fighting them and then killing them in an AoE stun and using big defensives. At least it's Tyrannical week, so their damage output isn't too high. Like, Raging Tyrannical it's more than Fortified, but like Raging Tyrannical is more than baseline Fortified, but it's not actually that much more. It's still reasonable. It's not like Raging Fortified would be, where it would just be absolutely one-shotting people at pretty much any reasonable key level. Beyond that, there are a couple of explosive threats in this dungeon. I think that they can spawn on Lady Waycrest in this boss fight. I'm not actually 100% sure about that. I'm pretty sure I've seen it, but now that I mention it, that sounds pretty stupid, so if that's in the game, that probably shouldn't be, because it's really. But I think I remember having to kill those things, so I'm not sure. Usually it's the healer who just kills them when they're that far away, or the ranged DPS, which is rarely me. So, but be wary. It might be something that happens. That's something that I should probably research before making these videos. But what can you do? Here we are. And then explosive spawns on this boss when ads are coming in is something to watch out for. And on this boss, if somehow you end up separating the sisters, which can happen, I've seen it. If you have them spread all over various parts of the room, that can be a spooky thing to have happen. So try not to do that. That usually ends up happening when things go wrong anyways. The normal kind of meta strat these days is to fight them all right where they spawn and not do anything that would cause them to really split. So doing that, I think, is probably the safer thing to do. Don't kite this enemy while it's locked on its spellcast and get them to separate. That's a bad thing to do. Thanks for watching This Week in Mythic Plus. Hope this has helped you prepare you for the dungeons this week. If it did, remember to like and subscribe, and check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.